All right, let's get started now. Hello, everyone. I hope you all are well. Welcome to our webinar, Business Succession Planning for Construction Companies, Thoughts for the Transition. I am Philip Ross, partner and practice leader of Anchin's Construction Industry Group. The successful transition of a business's management and ownership requires forethought and planning well ahead of when the transition is needed, years ahead of when it's needed. Too often, business owners are caught up in the day-to-day activities and don't focus on the big picture and how the business will continue in the future. In this joint webinar with Anchin and Cohen Seglias, our panel of professionals will discuss and explore the issues that need to be addressed in order to implement a successful transition. These include evaluating the options, next generation leadership development, talent retention, and managing the buy-sell expectations of the current and future owners. The presenters will discuss the nuts and bolts of succession planning, understanding what value is for your company, the sale of the business to a third party, good approaches to maintain and receive value for the goodwill that your business has developed, and strategies to transfer ownership internally, whether to key employees or family members. Thank you to my colleague, Brian Kenet of Anchin and Marion Kornelowitz of Cohen Seglias for their time here today. My partner, Fred Ackerman, was going to present as well, but he's out sick today, so I will be covering some of the slides for him. If you have any questions and are unable to access the Q&A panel on the sidebar, please email events@anchin.com. We will also circulate the slides and recording within a week. And now, without further ado, let me present our first speaker, Marion Kornelowitz of Cohen Seglias.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Phil, thank you for the introduction. And folks, thank you for joining us in this webinar. By way of introduction, I am the head of the business practice group at Cohen Seglias. I would say at least half our client base is construction related, and most of the transactions, or a good part of the transactions that we handle, are related to construction industry players in one way or the other. We often and regularly counsel our clients on how to pull money out of a company, how to develop an exit strategy, whether it's selling to the third parties, the external sale, selling in-house, the internal sale, handing the reins over to the next generation of family members, or often a combination of all these. But this is a collaborative effort. This involves legal counsel. This involves tax consultants, and it should also involve a estate planning person, because all those aspects play into this transaction. Typical scenario is a very successful business owner in their 50s or 60s. They want to get cash out of their business. They want to reduce or eliminate risks and headaches. They want to work less, play more. And in many cases, they want to maintain their legacy going forward. So the questions are many, but what's important to the business owner? Is it cash now? Do you liquidate? Do you want to maintain the brand into the future? Do you want to keep your hand in the business after you start selling? Do you want to get out as soon as possible? And how does all that dovetail with an estate plan for your children, your spouse, and other heirs? These factors and how important they are to you will factor into who the buyer is, what kind of buyer is it? Will it be a competitor, local? Will it be a private equity firm? And it'll factor into the structure of the transaction. So typically, you, the successful business person, knows your business and the personal situation. You probably have an idea what the business is worth, but if you don't, then you can have your experts, your consultants give you an indication of what that may be worth. You sort of have an idea of what you want to do. You may not know how to implement it. So if all these things are true, you're sort of ahead of the game compared to many, many other businesses. And I'll give you some examples. So by way of background, our economy is an economy of small businesses. 90% are family owned or independent. The SBA estimates that in the next 10, 15 years, 70% of these businesses will exchange hands, either through, well, through many ways. We'll discuss those. And this transfer, this exchange, will be the largest intergenerational transfer of wealth in US history. So what happens to family businesses? 50 to 50% don't survive. 50 to 55% don't survive to even have a succession plan. Those that do go into the second generation are probably 30 to 40%. 12% go into the third generation, and 4%, and in the fourth generation, only 3% survive. So there was a business survey, and only a third of these companies have what they define as a robust, documented, and communicated succession plan. Most people have an idea of what's going on, but a very small percentage actually have a plan that's been vetted and discussed and collaboratively put together. COVID has had an interesting impact on this process because the statistics show that communication in family businesses has increased because of COVID or as a result of COVID. And there's more communication between family members. 40% of businesses say that they want the next generation to be involved and increase their involvement in the business. And many have taken steps to implement that. 67% have next-gen family members working, and that number could even be higher, and I'll show you that in a second. And a good majority expect that they'll remain in the family over the next 5 years. So here's an interesting chart. If you look at the bottom, no next-gen involvement in the business, it's only 19%. So 80% more or less of people, of these small businesses, have some involvement of the next generation in the business. And what's also interesting about this chart is how this country compares to the global, how we are so family-oriented, and as compared to the statistic that only 62% of international businesses have the next generation involved. So what happens when things don't work out? And you can look at the next chart, and you can summarize it, I think, based on the lack of mid-level to high-level management that's within the company. The problem also becomes to nurture that mid-level management and retain them. So if you look at this, the majority of failures are because of the lack of management, the lack of transferring to management, people leaving because there's no plan, when there's no room for advancement. So the succession plan not only provides for the next generation, but it keeps people working for you that you need to keep the business successful. There was a survey conducted by FMI, which is a big player in succession in the construction industry. And the takeaway that I have from the next slide is that talent is critical. Talent needs to be identified, it needs to be nurtured, and it needs to be retained. That's the key to any succession plan. The next point that's sort of important here, this was in 2013, but even back then, this comment was made that owners are increasingly relying on third-party sales. I would say that they're increasingly hoping on a third-party sale. And the reality is many won't find that third-party buyer. Next chart will show that. So if you look at this chart, you'll see that about 6% get sold to an outsider, which is that third-party private equity, pie-in-the-sky buyer. 20% close up, liquidate either in an organized fashion or not so organized. But if you look at it, almost 65% transfer to key employees or family members. That is probably the realistic option for most small companies. Well, what are the options? You sell your ownership interest to a co-owner. You have a partner for many years. That partner is one generation younger, then that's great. You sell your business to key employees, wonderful way to work things out. You pass it on to family members, or you sell it externally to someone outside. When do you do this? You do it during your lifetime. You can gift, you can sell, you can gift. You can gift at death, or by default, you can gift at death, or you can by default liquidate at death. And you will not get value, and heirs will not get value if there is a forced liquidation at death. And that's pretty obvious. So people we know, transfer to family members and transfer to business partners and key employees. How is that accomplished? Internally, it can be done by the company buying the ownership interest of the retiring person, or there can be cross purchases between the owners of the company. There are advantages and disadvantages to both. The biggest disadvantage with the redemption is that if you imagine two owners, if you redeem the 50% owner, the owner that remains, their value, their ownership in the company went up to 100%, but their basis remained the same. So there's going to be a greater tax consequence, even though in effect they've paid for part of that purchase price. Cross purchases agreements, you have that common. There's issues with life insurance policies, but that is a way to fund the buyout in that kind of cross purchase arrangement. Transfer to existing employees. How to initiate issues that will have to be considered and discussed with your consultants. How to initiate the discussion and when. How far along are you in outlining what it is that you want to propose? Preserving confidentiality is pretty simple with non-disclosure agreements. How to sell to employees who lack the capital. That is always an issue, either self-fund, or in some cases there may be financing available to the employees. We did a transaction where the 50% owner obtained a loan to acquire the remaining 50%, and the company guaranteed that loan, sort of a leveraged buyout, but that sometimes could work. How to sell your ownership interest without retaining responsibility for bonding. That is always a problem in our industry. At what point does the new ownership able to get their own bonding, and you can be removed off of the bonds? Transition of stocks, staging that transition while everyone gets to know each other, figures out whether they'll be able to work with each other. And then there's restrictive covenants, buyback provisions if something goes wrong. An option is always ESOP. You talk to your consultants about that. On the sales side, there's either an asset purchase or a stock sale. Transfer of ownership to the next generation. When you talk about this, what to expect from the next generation, how do you transition to the next generation without losing key employees? We've done that many times, and the reality is that those key employees need to be incentivized to stay. Oftentimes that is some kind of ownership interest for them. And then always this estate planning aspect, which needs to be discussed with your estate planning expert. And some of the issues with respect to that are if you give one of your children or gift or sell, however, the part of the business, how do you provide for everyone else, and how do you keep things fair and equal among them? Prenuptial agreements to protect your children's interest in the company is a factor for a lot of people. So within this gift, within this generation of family transfers, you can do gifting during the course of a life. You can have sales, and again, transfer of death, or a combination of some of these. And it's interesting when you have a particular client talking to their tax consultant, accounting consultant, how those consultants come up with different packages of the gifting and of the sale. Benefits to your family. The unknown becomes the known. There's equity or fairness among the heirs. And always tax efficiency, minimize taxes is the key. If you wait for things to default, it's probably not the most tax efficient way of dealing with things. Sale to outside parties. Two options really. There's the asset sale where the assets are sold. And I've done transactions where there's an asset sale to key employees. And when you do that, for example, the last one, in a company that's involved in residential housing, building homes, the people don't want to buy a company that's got a potential history of warranty claims. So the idea is it's an asset sale, is a new entity, which minimizes some of those risks. Stock sale, that's simple. Merger or acquisition, well, merger typically occurs in a complicated or more sophisticated transaction, which is basically an asset sale, but it's done through reorganizations and things like that. So what's an asset sale? The company sells the business assets to the purchaser, goodwill, contracts, hard assets, whatever it might be. The sale proceeds are paid to the company and the liabilities stay with the company. Advantages, the purchasers only acquire what they want and need. They cherry pick. It's easy to get financing. Lenders are much more willing to lend in an asset sale than they would be in a stock sale. And there's favorable tax treatment because of depreciations that the buyer has based on the purchase price, the basis the buyer has based on the purchase price. The problems, disadvantages, how do you resolve some of the liabilities with the selling company, the warranties, the completion of projects? And again, not everyone has great tax benefits from an asset sale. The option is a stock sale. Stock sales don't occur very often. Buyers prefer asset sales. They don't want to buy a pig in a poke. They don't want to buy the skeletons in the closet. They don't want to assume liability for the sexual harassment lawsuits and the warranty claims, which is a big issue in our industry. So we don't see a lot of equity sales, but it does happen. There are advantages to both. Again, tax in the stock sale could be more advantageous to the seller because maybe more of it is treated as capital gains rather than ordinary income. And the disadvantages, purchasers don't like it, banks don't like it, and there's tax aspects because you can't depreciate unless you go really complicated with different kind of structures. Merger, like I mentioned earlier, mergers typically occur in the context of reorganization, which is part of a bigger transaction to convert a corporation to an LLC or an S into a partnership. It's not something I see very often as a way of succession planning by itself. Payment, big issue, obviously. Sometimes the buyer obtains financing. SBA financing is available out there sometimes. I mentioned that sort of leverage financing where the company essentially guarantees the financing. Guarantees and collateral. Is there collateral besides the assets of the company? What happens if there's a default? Do you want to take over the company? Bonding and guarantor issues. As I said earlier, really a big issue in this industry. Unless there's a really strong competitor buying the business, third party, or a private equity company, the key employees probably on their own will not qualify for bonding to the extent that you can be removed as a guarantor or a surety or an obligor under an indemnity agreement. All right, why have a succession plan? I've touched on most of these. And not only the transition of you and your business and the legacy, it's a way to retain, develop key employees. Maximize business value. If you don't have those key employees there, your value is less. Or tax efficiency, always a good thing. And if you can plan, you can probably obtain a more efficient tax transaction. And a smooth transition rather than, you know, the being hit by the bus and everyone scrambling to figure out who's going to run the company. Action steps. Focus on goals and timelines, determine lifestyle needs, gather information. A lot of options. But again, putting together a team is important. Before you get started, never take action without knowing the long-term impact of something. Neither you nor your advisor should operate in a vacuum. Consultation, this is a process. It's not something that's done overnight. Long-term financial tax implications of each option for a transfer. Choose the option that fits your needs. Different options for different folk, depending on what's more important. Transaction clients are debating whether to go with a major investment banker and have decided in the short term to explore local buyers because it's important that for their employees, they think, legitimately, rather than a institutional private equity buyer from California. Again, the state issue, how to equalize the assets going to the heirs, communication, always important. Are you ready to sell? Well, even if you're not ready to sell, you should be ready to start planning on that. What's the next step? What's the best time to sell? You'll reach that conclusion after you start considering the options and the consequences. How do you maximize the value? You should, talking to your financial consultants will help you do that. There's things that can be done to make your financial statements stronger, look stronger. Do you want to sell and retire? Conclusion. This is not an event. It's not something you do within 2 or 3 months. I get phone calls. We start conversations early in the year. I get phone calls in December. Let's get something effective by January 1st. And we do that. That's not optimal. You cannot start too early in that process, but you can certainly wait too long. And that's all I have. So, Brian, I believe you're next.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Marion. So my name is Brian Kenet. I specialize in succession planning at Anchin. We're a 100-year-old accounting, tax, and advisory firm based in Manhattan, and we've been working with construction clients for going on about 100 years. I'm going to talk about a little bit more detail about the process, but a lot of what I and my colleague Phil will talk about will echo what Marion has just said, reinforce a number of his comments. Let me start by outlining some of the challenges. No doubt these are familiar to many of you, but one of the best ways to address the challenges is to be very clear about what they are. Many of your businesses are family businesses, and I think one of the biggest challenges is that interpersonal and family dynamics can complicate what might otherwise be a more straightforward business process or financial transaction. This is not just about money. It's often about the family. As a result, there are numerous competing or conflicting considerations. And the success really revolves around finding a sweet spot where you can come into balance between these conflicting considerations. So obviously, the current owner or owners, they want to maximize their proceeds, their liquidity. But that needs to be done without overburdening the firm or monopolizing the capital needed for the business to be successful in the future. If the business is going to borrow money to buy out key shareholders, that can place some significant burden going forward, and you need to make sure that that burden is manageable. Often you want to respect and honor your business history, its legacy, its values, its culture. But if you're not careful, that can come at the expense of being able to meet the future needs of the business. So you want to find a way to honor the history, but without robbing the firm of what it needs going forward. You need to preserve harmony between family members and key employees who are not family members in order to keep the business strong. You favor one too much over the other, and in the long run, that can erode the strength of the business. You need to find a way, even if you want to transition within the family, as Marion said, you need to find a way to reward and retain, loyal management and key staff so that the business can remain competitive in the marketplace. So, you know, none of this is easy. All of these are, you know, challenges. That's one of the reasons why, as Marion said, this is an ongoing process. This is not an event necessarily with a clear, you know, goal line. So going forward, Phil and I, we're going to try to demystify some of these steps, make them a little bit more explicit in your mind. First one, start early. Time is either going to be your friend or it's going to be your enemy. These are complex, multi-dimensional, multi-year processes. They have financial, strategic, legal, emotional dimension. Generally, you need at least 5 years to do a good job. It's important to separate the notion of retirement from exiting financially. The more you can exit financially before you really retire, that has many advantages, financial, strategic, and other ways as well. So you really need to assume you need at least 5 years to do a good job. You need an internal champion. This has to be driven either from the top by the people who are going to be exiting, or by some of the next generation, so they feel ownership and they're empowered and they become invested, not just financially, but psychologically in the success of this process. Crucially, the whole process needs to be holistically and proactively designed. It shouldn't be, you know, a patchwork quilt of ad hoc fixes that react to a problem here, a problem there. It has to be holistically designed. And with that in mind, because there are a lot of technical issues, whether they're legal, financial, tax, bonding, it's important to start with the big picture concepts and come up with a holistic vision for how you're going to do it before you dig too deep into the weeds and think about the technical aspects. So what are some of these key concepts? The first is a vision. You have to articulate a vision, whether it's for the short term or the medium term or the long term of the business. And part of that vision is articulating clear leadership roles for the next generation, whether they're family members or non-family member employees. The vision, this is not just about the owner's exit. The vision is about designing a robust future for the business. Crucial to the vision is the talent, as Marion said. And one of the first things to think about is, for anybody who is selling and retiring, what skills and talents are they taking with them that are going to need to be replaced? And to the extent you have certain skills or talents that need to be replaced, let's say rainmaking, who will be the replacement? And do you have that talent in the family, in the firm, or do you need to look outside to supplement skills and talents that are going to go away? Then you need to think about, what are the goals, what are the aspirations of the next generation talent, and how can you create incentives so that they feel motivated and empowered to achieve their own goals by staying at the firm and doing what you want them to do. So it's not just creating incentives, thinking about talent, it's really developing leadership. You could say that leadership is a combination of talent, things that are born with skills that can be taught and learned, and leadership is a combination of those two things. Generally, you want to select for talent, which are the things you can't teach. Some people are great networkers, they're people, you know, they really go out and they make contacts, but that doesn't mean you can't build skills on top of that. And it's important to demonstrate the business is willing to invest in somebody's talent and nurture that so they grow in their leadership skills. So they become you have not only an opportunity to become an owner, you have an opportunity to become better at your job. Another key concept is financial performance, accountability, and incentives. The value of the business is very closely tied to the financial performance at the time of the transition. So you need to establish expectations and identify the behaviors people need to demonstrate in order to meet those expectations. And then you can design and tailor financial incentives to meeting those expectations. It's important to keep in mind, you don't have to create identical incentives for each person. If two people are motivated differently, they have different goals and aspirations, there's no reason why you can't customize incentives for different people. That helps to demonstrate how and why for any crucial person staying at the firm and leading the business going forward is going to give them the best chance to achieve their financial and career goals. So what are some of the first steps to get the ball rolling? First thing is ask yourself, am I ready and is my organization ready to do this? And if you identify gaps, that's the key. Identify the gaps now. That's one of the reasons why it often takes 5 years, because if you say, we don't have enough rainmakers, or we have weak internal controls, or we're just not making the kind of profit that we could make, that's something that can take years to improve. So after you've identified gaps and you started working to fill those gaps, then you can start thinking about alternatives and the pros and cons. Obviously, one big differentiating characteristic between selling to a third party or to your family or to your employees or to an ESOP is how much financial yield can you get, both before tax and after tax. And you need to evaluate the trade-offs between maximizing your financial rewards and achieving, other kinds of considerations. What's the impact on your people going forward? That's really a key thing to think about. You want to consider the impact on current leadership, future leadership, the family, and the business's ability to attract, retain, and incentivize talent. Particularly in a family business, you want to think about any unique characteristics that could complicate the overall picture. And all of this turns into what the impact will be on the long-term sustainability and competitiveness of the business. And as Marion said, often the tax considerations need to be thought of pretty far in advance. So once you've evaluated your opportunities, then you can, pick which one seems to be the best fit and start to develop a time frame to implement it and getting any professional advisors that you need on board before you get started. So first question is, are you ready? And if not, what are the gaps? The way to evaluate that, there are really 4 things, and they all start with P. People. Do you have the right people in the right job roles with the right incentives to perform? Are there any unique family considerations that you need to take into account? The next P is productivity. Is the firm operating as efficiently as possible? Are you maximizing margins? Are you minimizing your working capital? The other word for those 2 things are profits. Is the company maximizing its profitability? Whether you're going to sell to a third party or internally to employees or transition to a family member, how much you yield is directly tied to how profitable and how much free cash flow you're generating at the time you transition. doesn't have a whole lot to do with how well you did in years in the past. It's really at the moment, while you're transitioning or while delayed payments need to be made. And then the fourth P is really the perseverance of the business. How do you protect that? The firm can continue to persevere and succeed going forward. Are you organized in the right way to do that? And that's where internal controls, risk management, rainmaking, cybersecurity is a big issue right now. You know, a lot of times, if you have a founder or some, you know, family patriarch or matriarch, a lot of times the internal controls, the risk management happens informally within their head. A lot of times you have to take what was done informally and intuitively and do it formally and, you know, with a concrete process that needs to be established going forward. Then based on the results of your readiness analysis, you can take step to close the gaps, shore up the weaknesses, improve your profitability, and begin your plan. So what are the options? Well, obviously, as Marion said, they're basically two generic kinds. Internal, that's a sale to employees or family members. An ESOP is a version of internal transition that has a unique set of pros and cons. External transition, sale to a third party, can be to a strategic buyer like another company, a financial buyer like private equity, or an individual investor with relevant expertise. Marion referred to the SBA. If your business meets the criteria for SBA lending, the SBA has lending options that are quite a bit better than just about any bank you can go to. So particularly for smaller firms, there are really some fantastic lending options for SBA loans that construction companies are eligible for. And then you evaluate each option, pros and cons, how much money you can realize, what will be the impact on your people, and the relative impact on the sustainability and competitiveness of the business, and then tax, tax, bonding, those kinds of considerations. So the key question is, what's the best option in light of all the relevant factors, whether they be financial, strategic, cultural, tax, and crucially, how feasible? One option might sound great, but it may not just be feasible based on the unique characteristics of your business. I'd say the good news is the things you want to do to optimize your proceeds and your feasibility to sell internally, and what you need to do to maximize your proceeds and feasibility to sell externally are the same thing. You focus on people, productivity, profits, and the protection and perseverance of the business. The other thing to say, and Marion mentioned this, is internal and an external transition are not mutually exclusive. Family, employees, third party can be combined, either simultaneously or sequentially. For example, you might lock in the next generation of leadership with equity. If you do that, they will then have an incentive to increase profitability and value of the business. They will then have better financial foundation themselves to buy more going forward. They'll also have a financial incentive to support an external sale because they'll be beneficiaries of the proceeds. And then crucially, external buyers will see a coherent, sustainable leadership team. And that's very important for any third-party buyer to decide whether or not they want to buy a business. So with that, I'll turn it over to Phil, who will talk a little bit more about getting ready and then walk through a sale process, internal and external.
Great. Thank you, Brian, and thank you, Marion. And also just a reminder for everybody, any questions you have, please submit through the Q&A section over here. We're definitely going to be able to answer questions at the end, so please send any of them as we go along, so this way we'll be able to address them later on. So as Brian said, whether you're going to do an internal transition, an external, an ESOP, a lot of the mechanisms and preparation you need to do are really the same. So first of all, the healthier the business is, the more profitable the business is, the more cash flow the business has, the easier it's going to be to sell to an outsider and get a better value and better price. The easier it's going to be to entice internal people to want to step up to be part of it, whether it's family or whether it's key employees, and also be easier for them to be able to afford it later on if they're confident in the profitability of the company. So that's really key. So when Brian talked about this 5-year time frame, so you have 5 years to make decisions about whether you spend more money investing in the future, whether you spend more money maximizing the operating margins. Do you have a balancing act over there? Because you do have to still invest in the future to have the company set for the future, but maybe saving some money and maybe making some more profits might serve you better in the short term. So really take a look at your financial operations and what you're doing. You take a look at your reporting, because it's going to be even more important as you look to turn it over to someone else, whether internal or external, that they have the tools to be able to monitor the business, to be able to run the business and understand what the profitability is and spot any risk or spot any issues early enough to take steps to correct it. And then internal controls is definitely just a big item. When I'm sure everybody has stories, I know we do, when it was a smaller family construction company and the major owner was able to keep their finger on the pulse when the company was doing $15 to $20 million. Now the company is growing. It's a little tougher to really know all and understand all. So you really want to have the controls built in to help you and to help whoever you're going to sell it to be able to really have the right controls to run the business and to spot issues over there. And then when you do choose a leadership team, again, whether it's a leadership team that stays and buys the company or a leadership team that's going to stay and help the new buyer run the company, that's very important. A new buyer coming in, if it's a private equity firm, if it's ESOP financing back, they're going to want to know that number one, the old generation is staying for a period of time to help the transition. But number two, that there's a really good leadership team in there and the company's not going to miss too much of a beat. Because if there's not a good leadership team in there, then even the finance company, the bank, is going to be very concerned whether the company's going to really perform the way it did. So if you have the right people, you really want to incentivize them to stay. So whether it's the key employees to stay, to become part of ownership later on, or even if it's certain employees you want to stay and you don't think that they're right for ownership, but you really want them to be there. So you really want to have the incentives laid out. I'm sure everyone in the industry knows how tough it's been for retaining and attracting talent since COVID hit. So it's no different with this. You want to really design incentive packages that will reward them for performance, could reward them for pieces of the profit, could eventually lead to equity, or could be phantom equity. Phantom equity mirrors some of the benefits of equity, but without having the control from ownership, without having votes and things like that. In some situations, the employee likes it better because there's also a little less risk for them. You want to take a look at the long term, what's going to work and what's going to retain. Some different compensation strategies are very good that way. And then you also want to make sure that it may not be a financial incentive, but it's a morale and it's a culture building incentive that you're going to continue to invest in your people and develop them and mentor them so they know that you're going to help them to get as good as they can be. So phase one is to evaluate your options and the feasibility. So you look at your financial information, you sit down with your advisors, your accountants, your attorneys. If you're using any kind of an investment firm, you can speak with them as well. And you really want to try to figure out, what is your strategic advantage? What's the reason why, whether it's here for internal, what's the reason why your family or your people would want to stay with the firm, if you're not there, and what makes you different. So you have to really emphasize that. You have to vocalize it so that people understand. If someone's been at your firm for a long time, they may sense it internally, but they may not really know what it is. So always accentuating your positives is going to be very helpful. Definitely taking a look to see what your earnings are, what your cash flow are. That's for what's the real value of the company. So what's the real value, and then what could the next generation afford as well? Because you want to get good value. And if it's an internal transition, if it's family, you may feel you don't need to get the last dollar, which happens lots of times. But you also want to make sure that the company will be able to afford for the new owners the profits to be able for them to make the payments to you going forward. Because in lots of these situations, the selling owners are the ones that take on the debt. The bank doesn't always come in to give the financing to the new owners. So you also want to make sure, for their sake and for your sake, the business will generate the profits for them to be able to make the payments and for you to get paid. We talked about valuation. You also want to take a look at the strengths and weaknesses, the advantages and disadvantages of doing the internal sale. And as Brian and Marion said, you have to look at family dynamics. If you have some family in the business, but you really sit there and say, you know what, these two children of mine, they're great in the business and they're able to run it and they're really going to be future leaders. But you have one or two others that they might be good for the business and they fill a role, but maybe they're not going to be ownership people. Or maybe you structure things to give more control to the real future leaders, but you give a share of the profits and value to the others. It's a balancing act, and every situation is different. We talked about being ready for this, and Brian went through the 4 Ps already, but that's very important, again, whether it's internal or it's an external sale. And then to model out the options. Once you lay out the options, it's not always necessarily the price, but it's also the terms. So model out the options, as Marion had talked about. Model out what your personal financial needs are as well. It might be better for you, both tax-wise and lifestyle-wise, to get payments over 5 years or 6 years or 7 years. In some instances, it might be better to get in a shorter period of time. So that's all things that you should be working through. Then phase 2, in order to optimize the firm, make sure you know who the next generation of leaders and owners are. And there's a distinction here. You could have someone in management who you may not deem to be an owner, a future owner, and vice versa. So definitely identify. And as Brian had mentioned, if there is a gap, whether it's on the technical side, the relationship side, the rainmaking side, look to fill it. Make sure the incentives are going to be in place, and make sure the people who are going to get these incentives understand the incentives. It's one thing to tell them you're going to give them a piece of the profits. To really quantify, to explain it to them so that they can really understand what that means, and whether it's $50,000 a year or $250,000 a year in certain times, that could really make a difference for them to really appreciate what you're trying to do to keep them and to incentivize them. And then, as we talked about, maximizing the margins and cash flow, and also making sure that you're keeping the risk and the internal controls really under control and up to date, and revising them for the fact that you will have new people in management, new people in ownership. Then the financial planning for the actual transaction. So you really have to agree on a valuation. If it's going to be internal, you, through the modeling, et cetera, will have an idea of the value. You're going to feel that it's fair. You also have to communicate that to the buyers, whether it's 1, whether it's 5, whether it's an ESOP. You have to communicate that so they understand and they're able to buy in. There can be some negotiation that goes on, but you want them to you also want to demonstrate to them how it would be affordable for them. You want it to be a win-win for both sides, where you get fair value and they're also going to be able to take the company, afford the buy-in, and also hopefully take the company even to a greater level, which would be a testament to the generation that was selling. You structure the deal, and there's so many things that can happen with structuring the deal. You could have a stock or an asset deal, and it's not always the price, but it's really what do you want to end up with after tax dollars. So you could do a stock deal for X and end up with Y. You could do an asset deal for a different number and end up with more or less. So it's really looking at the after-tax dollars over there. How many years is it going to be paid out over? Are you going to be employed or not employed? What's your employment contract over there? Is there interest on the unpaid amount? If the company does better, do you get an earnout? And maybe there's even more upside for you. But if you get an earnout and the company does even better, then obviously it's more upside for the new owners as well. And it kind of ties in the old owners to be able to really work together with the new owners. You have to understand financing. Are you going to try to get a bank involved in this? Or is it going to be seller finance and you're going to get an amount down? Maybe a bank finance is part of it, and then you get paid over time. And again, based on that, there's also tax considerations as well. Governance. You have to make sure that the new generation ends up with agreements. All the agreements that they should have, you should make sure that they also sign on to the buy-sell agreements that are there currently, and that they're comfortable with it. So again, that's something that they have to do now. And then going forward, you want the governance to be there as well. And you might also, for a period of time, stay on in a governance role as well, since you have the experience of how the company really is supposed to run. And then you want to look out as part of selling this to, whether it's outside or inside, you want to look out 5 years, sometimes even 10 years, to really show what's going to happen and why this is going to be so valuable and how it's going to be profitable to the people that are buying in. And then obviously you're consulting with everybody throughout this, and there are negotiations that go on. And one thing you have to, it's a lot less with internal, with external. Once you start, if you're not satisfied, you have to have the willpower to be able to stop and maybe go to a different alternative that's going to be better for you. Too often, I think Brian and I have seen when we work on these types of situations, somebody starts and the deal is not the deal that they thought it was going to be, or the people were not the people they were going to be, or they were looking to change. And you really have to have the strength to be able to say, this is not what we think is right for ourselves and also for the company and our employees. We have to go in a different direction. It takes a lot of courage to do. Phase 4 is launching the transition plan. Everyone is agreed, everybody's bought in, the legal documents are all executed and everything. So at this point, it's really, everything is done. It's really just the formalities of signing. You've talked about what the issues are. You've talked about what the agreement is. You've talked about all the clauses and terms. And we always recommend get that done up front. Don't let the legal documents then come and address things in some of the legal documents, because you never know what kind of a surprise there could be. And definitely you have to also make sure during this process, other people in the company are going to find out, whether it's internal or external. You have to manage that internal communication. You don't want to do it too early. You just don't want to do it too far down the line, because if some of your employees here and they're not involved in this transition, you don't want to lose other good employees who maybe you don't feel are right for ownership, but it's still important to the company. And then after that, you really have the whole implementation and the monitoring and the refinement, making sure things are working, making sure if you have an employment contract to be there for 2, 3, 4, 5 years, that transition is still going along. Make sure that you see there's no additional gaps that you can try to help with. And also just make sure that, if the company was functioning at a certain level, it's still there. If it's not, are there other things that have to be done? You may have a voice, you may not, but it definitely would be welcome information to the new owners. So now we'll talk about the external sale process. And instead of going through everything that's different, everything that's the same, we'll go through what's different. And I think we talked about what the initial analysis is and everything. It's really the same. You're probably doing more of a sales job here for external than for internal, because a lot of the internal transitions, the people already know the company a little bit over there. Once you do that, you need to develop, and this is where your advisors come in, develop a list of potential buyers. So whether it's going to be a strategic buyer who's a competitor, whether it's going to be someone from outside the geographic area who wants to come in, whether it's a PE firm, whatever it is, you have to develop that together. And then you also have to make sure, what do you also want to achieve related to chemistry? Typically you want to buy in and be on the same page with this external buyer, what they see for the future of the company, what their values are, what the culture of the company is, what are the synergies, what are the expectations. If you do achieve, strategic and financial synergies? Do you benefit from that financially as well? So that's also something that you want to make sure that you consider and you come to an agreement on amongst the current owners as well. And then there's a confidential blind profile that's put together, and that's what's used to go to the list of potential buyers to start to entice them. So phase two, you go to market, you've qualified the buyers, you approach them confidentially with the teaser, you gauge their interest, you get feedback from them, you see who's really interested, but who has questions and everything, and then you try to boil it down to who's really interested and wants to really go to the next step. And that's when you get non-disclosure agreements put together, you get it signed, et cetera, because up until this point, you're giving enough information to hopefully get them interested, but not too much. And also you usually don't identify the name of the company at that point because you want to control the flow of the information getting out. And then it comes time to really try to make the deal. So here you really go through a lot more information. The potential buyers will ask more questions. They're going to ask for more information. You should also ask for information from them because if you're dealing with a potential buyer, you want to make sure that they can afford the transaction. If they can't afford the transaction, if they've had a history of doing deals and they fall apart, if they had a history of completing transactions and then the integration doesn't work, that could influence your decision here as well. Then after you go through all of that, and they may have some limited due diligence that's done at that point, but not too much, you really want to get proposals from the buyers. And as we said, it's not necessarily the price, but it's how you're getting paid, it's how quickly you're getting paid, it's guarantees, it's how much money is up front, and this all goes through a negotiation. And again, as we said before with the internal, the more of this that you could flesh out and you can agree on before the letter of intent, the better off you are and the less surprises you'll have, and the less deep sighs you're going to have to take to say, you know, I'm really not happy with that situation, but we're so far down the line. How can I get it changed? So really, before the letter of intent is signed, try to make sure as much of the issues and terms are really agreed on as possible. Even though it's not binding, it still is a lot easier than negotiating it later on. Then once you've done that, then it's all the devil is in the details. There's due diligence that's done. It's financial due diligence. And you hope that there's no surprises and that there's no issues with any of the financial information you furnish to them that they find. I will say that when you look at smaller situations, and this is Brian and I have found this as well, revenue and revenue recognition has been one of the biggest things to pull deals apart. When you're looking at small situations, bigger situations, typically that's not the issue over there, but there is a due diligence that's done. There's legal due diligence that's done. There's insurance due diligence that's done. There may be some diligence that they want done on some performances, on contracts that you say you have through that. And then there are definitely some final negotiations for that final agreement. And obviously the lawyer is intimately involved in all these steps, but even more so over here. And then hopefully you reach an agreement and the documents are all set and you close the transaction. And then hopefully you have shake hands and whatever you've agreed on, you have, and you go forward from them and everybody works together to accomplish what you work so hard to agree on. Okay, so just want to check if we have any questions here. So one question we have, which is for Marion, on the legal side, if you had to rank the 2 to 5 most important items and items that blow deals apart, what would you say?
On the legal side, generally lawyers are able to work around the issues, the legal issues, the warranties, the survival of the warranties, the indemnification, the caps on liability, the baskets on liability. So it's rare that a deal falls apart because of that. Deals fall apart because in the due diligence, things aren't coming up the way people expected them to come up. That's my experience.
Okay, great, thank you.
I would just add, it's not a legal problem, but there's a saying which is the number one killer of deals is time. Because excessive time can lead to fatigue. It can also just create time for either party to change their mind or for the market environment to change. Interest rates can change. The general business environment can change. So a rule of thumb, particularly on external transactions, is once the letter of intent has been signed, you want to move as fast as possible because every day just creates more opportunity for something bad to happen.
That's a good
Agree.
point. And that's why I think earlier we talked about having an internal champion. You need someone who's really with a lot of influence, with very involved in management, who takes this on as their personal project and they push it so that they make sure others don't lose sight of that. Okay, well, I see we're a little past 1 o'clock. We were scheduled to go to 1 o'clock. So Marion or Brian, any final thoughts?
No. If anyone has any questions, they can email me or call me. If anything comes up after you've shut down and left the screens.
Yes, we have the contact information up, so please, and when we circulate the slides, you'll also have our contact information, so don't hesitate to reach out to any one of us. And I want to thank Marion and Brian for sharing their thoughts and their wisdom and their insights. And Anchin and Cohen Seglias also want to thank all the attendees here. We hope you found this to be worthwhile. It's definitely not an easy subject or an easy thing to deal with. And it also comes with a lot of other intangible, emotional, and psychological issues, especially with the family business. So we're glad you're able to attend, and thank you for being here. And again, any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. Hope everybody stays well.
Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you.